Well guys, thanks for watching and thanks for sticking around for the past 4 years. It really means a lot to me.
We're so back. After 3 years of stalling, yeesh, I should have done this sooner, I am finally getting around to making the last episode of Engines of Minnesota Commercial. A lot can change in 3 years, and a lot has changed for the Minnesota Commercial. The original owner and founder has passed away. Almost all of the Alco power has been completely ravaged from active service. And they're set to be replaced by brand new locomotives. But one thing has stayed consistent over the Minnesota Commercial's near 40-year existence, and that is their commitment to using General Electric motive power. But how does a company known for making washing machines and light bulbs end up making locomotives? Let's find out. The first locomotive General Electric had a hand in building was a 57-ton gasoline-electric box cab in 1913. The internal combustion electric drive would have been nothing short of revolutionary in the 1910s, and there's no doubt it helped pave the way for the modern diesel-electric locomotive of today. Fun fact before I move on, the engine I'm talking about was built for the Dan Patch electric lines, later known as the Minneapolis, Northfield, and Southern. Funny how fitting this is for a video talking about another Minnesota regional railroad. After a little while longer of building box cab and steeple cab switchers with internal combustion electric drives, General Electric finally got their first big break, so to speak, in 1940. That year they became business partners with the American Locomotive Company, or ALCO for short. Together they built full-size road engines like the RS series and the PAs. But in 1953, ALCO and GE had split up. Using the technical knowledge from ALCO, General Electric had created the Universal Series. These locomotives were initially just meant for export markets, but in 1959, General Electric had introduced its first domestic model, the U-25B. After just a few years of building its own engines in the American locomotive market, General Electric had taken ALCO's spot as the second biggest locomotive manufacturer in the United States behind EMD. During the 1970s and 80s, General Electric had held its own in the locomotive market. But by the 1990s, GE was able to really challenge EMD for number one. In '93, GE had introduced the Dash 9. Which went pretty well. Across all three variants, General Electric had sold a little under 5,000 Dash 9s, outselling all of EMD's offerings from the same time frame by a wide margin. Ever since production of the Dash 9 had ended in 2003, and the General Electric Evolution series, or GEVO for short, had also started up in 2003, General Electric has been firmly at the top slot ever since. In 2019, General Electric had sold its locomotive division to Wabtec, which continues to produce and lease out General Electric locomotives to this day. Now that we know how General Electric became a locomotive builder, which specific GE locomotives has the Minnesota Commercial had over the years? I'm going to get the locomotives that the Minnesota Commercial only has one of out of the way first. Not only is Minnesota Commercial number 42 the only SF30B Minnesota Commercial has, but it's also the only SF30B ever built. This locomotive started life in December of 1970 as Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe U-23B number 6332. In 1987, 6332 was involved in an accident bad enough to warrant a rebuild at the Cleburne, Texas shops. When it rolled back out, it may as well have been a completely different engine. It got a more modern looking Dash 7 style nose, it was renumbered from 6332 to 7200, and it got an experimental modified version of the General Electric 7FDL12 prime mover, boosting its power output from 2300 to 3000 horsepower, hence the SF30B name. Now SF30B number 72 200 would continue to work until the very end of Santa Fe and even into the first decade of BNSF. In 2004, BNSF had reverted it back to the regular 2300 horsepower General Electric 7 FDL-12 that it would have originally been built with. It would continue working with BNSF for another 4 years until 2009 when the Minnesota Commercial had bought it. It has since been repainted into the Minnesota Commercial's red, white, and black paint scheme, and it appears to still be a frequently used locomotive. C36-7 number 59 was the Minnesota Commercial's only imported locomotive. Yes, you heard me correctly, this engine was made overseas. It was built in May of 1978 in Australia as Hammersley Iron number 5059. The Hammersley Iron Railway is an iron ore railroad in the Pilbara region of Western Australia. One of many. The Hammersley Iron Railway is still around, although today it is now known as the Hammersley and Robe River Railway and is owned by the Rio Tinto Mining Company. 5059 was bought by the Minnesota Commercial in 2000 and so was shipped stateside. Upon touching steel wheels to steel rails again in the United States, it got the NREX patch and went on another long trip halfway across the country to the Great White North. Once in the hands of the Minnesota Commercial, it got repainted and renumbered to just 59. 59 was last seen in Silvis, Illinois in 2016, so it's probably safe to assume that it's long since been scrapped. But the fact that the Minnesota Commercial had an engine that wasn't built in America is very impressive. The Minnesota Commercial's lone C30-7 was built in December of 1976 as Burlington Northern number 5509. After serving 20 years on Burlington Northern and very briefly on BNSF, 5509 was sold to the National Railroad Equipment Company in 1997. Sometime between then and 2001, 5509 was bought by the Minnesota Commercial. It was subsequently repainted and renumbered to 55. It would work another 12 years until 2013 when number 55 was sold to the NRE again. Only this time it has stayed at the NRE. I don't know if it's been sold to another railroad, scrapped, or if it's still sitting around somewhere in Illinois, but if you do know, please tell me. We are now getting into much more common motive power. The B-23-7 was one of the most recognizable locomotives ever made by General Electric, and the Minnesota Commercial has had a whopping 12 of them over the years. Because there's so many, I won't be going through each individual locomotive's history, but just give a general overview. Of the 12 locomotives, a majority of them are ex-Conrail at 8 examples. 3 of them are ex-Santa Fe, and 1 of them is ex-East Penn. 8 of the engines are still on the railroad, but 4 of them have been sold to the NRE and or scrapped. A couple of the B-23-7s I find the most interesting are number 4208, built in April of 1978, mainly because almost all of the pictures of it online under the Minnesota Commercial's ownership are of it in storage in this weird spot not too far away from the main roundhouse, as well as a couple pictures of it behind BNSF Yard Slug number 3964, which would eventually become Minnesota Commercial Slug number T4, which, coincidentally, I have also talked about way back in episode 1 of this series over 4.5 years ago. Wow, I feel old. And the other B-23-7 I find interesting is ex-East Penn number 45, built in May of 1978. It was a Conrail locomotive numbered 1933 from 78 to 1999. Then in 99, it was bought by CSX and renumbered to 3153. When it was bought by the East Penn Railway in 2006, it kept its number but was repainted into their livery. It was bought by the Minnesota Commercial last year to replace one of the Alcos, only for it to just almost immediately be put into storage. It runs, it could do work as of the time of this recording, but the reason why it's here is because of those new locomotives I'd mentioned earlier. Still though, I find the reason why it's in storage in the first place to be very funny. The B-23-7 and the B-30-7 were being built at around the same time and looked just about identical visually. The only differences between the two are that the B-30-7's prime mover has 4 more cylinders and makes 750 more horsepower. The Minnesota Commercial's B-30-7 roster includes the other East Penn locomotive, number 51, 3 former Frisco and later Burlington Northern locomotives numbered 48, 88, and 54, and 1 ex-Chesapeake and Ohio and later CSX locomotive numbered 49. So far, the Minnesota Commercial has kept all of their B-30-7s, but with brand new locomotives becoming a legitimate threat, their days may or may not be numbered. As of the time of this recording, the B-39-8Es are the most modern locomotives on the Minnesota Commercial, being built between November of 1987 and March of 1988. All 4 of the Minnesota Commercial's B-39-8Es were built for LMX, a subsidiary leasing company of General Electric. It is because of this during their entire Class 1 careers that they wore the General Electric demonstrator colors instead of the paint scheme of whichever railroad they were on long-term lease to, which in this case would be Burlington Northern. They were around for the final years of BN and into the early years of BNSF before all being sold to Relco in the early to mid-2000s. It is at this point where their paths diverge, with 2 of the 4 numbered 8581 and 8543 being sold to the NRE. But by 2012, the Minnesota Commercial had bought them and now had 3 of their 4 -8s. RLCX number 8581, 8543, and 8574 all became Minnesota Commercial number 58, 84, and 87, but it wasn't until 2019 that the Minnesota Commercial finally got their last -8. RLCX number 8512, which was repainted and renumbered to 85. Like I said earlier, the -8s are the Minnesota Commercial's newest locomotives as well as their most powerful. So honestly, I don't see them going anywhere anytime soon. The B-36-7s are the Minnesota Commercial's second most modern and powerful locomotives, and they have 2 of them. Minnesota Commercial number 76 was built in July of 1985 as Seaboard System number 5884. When CSX Transportation officially took over in 1986, Seaboard 5884 became CSX 5884. Sometime between 2010 and 2013, it was sold to Trans-Kentucky Transportation Inc., or TTI for short. In 2022, TTI number 5884 was sold to the Minnesota Commercial. So far, it has been renumbered to 76, but it has yet to be repainted in the red, white, and black colors. Minnesota Commercial's second B-36-7, numbered 75, was built in November of 1984 as Southern Pacific number 7754. On September 11th, 1996, the Southern Pacific was acquired by the Union Pacific, and so 7754 became a Union Pacific locomotive. In 2004, Union Pacific had decided to sell off all of their ex-Southern Pacific B-36-7s. The Minnesota Commercial had bought number 7754. In 2004, the Minnesota Commercial had repainted and renumbered it to 75, and it has been on the railroad ever since. And last, but certainly not least, are the SF-30Cs. Like the SF-30B from earlier in the video, the SF-30Cs are also Santa Fe rebuilds from the 80s. About 70 U-36Cs had been rebuilt with modified noses and prime movers, and the Minnesota Commercial had 2 of them. The later of the 2 to be on the Minnesota Commercial was built in February of 1975 as U-36C number 8798. After 8798's rebuild in 1986, it was renumbered to 9561. In 1995, just before the BNSF merger, 9561 was sold to the NRE. It had spent some time between 8 or 9 years in their possession before being sold to the Minnesota Commercial. When the Minnesota Commercial had acquired it, they gave it the usual treatment and renumbered it to 56. In 2013, number 56 was bought by the NRE again, and sometime afterward it was scrapped in Silvis, Illinois. And the Minnesota Commercial's first SF-30C was built in March of 1973 and numbered 8728. After its rebuild in 1985, it was renumbered to 9501. In 1996, 9501 was sold to the Minnesota Commercial and renumbered to 50. Due to number 50 being the last SF-30C left in America, it was given to the Arizona State Railroad Museum in 2022. To me, that's a pretty big score, and I can't wait to see it back in ATSF colors again someday. My apologies, but the video isn't quite over yet. Do you remember those brand new locomotives I kept alluding to throughout the video? Because Minnesota Commercial's loyalty to General Electric lives on. Later this year or sometime next year, they will be getting an order of either 4 or 6 Tier 4 compliant GEVOs. More likely than not, they'll have to be special 4-axle versions in order to fit around the tight industrial curves. In my honest opinion, I think it's way overkill to have a 4,500 horsepower locomotive doing the same amount of work as 2,500 and 3,000 horsepower locomotives, but meh, what do I know? The Minnesota Commercial will more likely than not increase the workload specifically for these locomotives, and the crews will probably like the cleaner, quieter, more modern cabs as well. Before I actually go, I have a couple of recommendations to make. Firstly, go check out all the channels I'd credited in the bottom left-hand corner. Links to all of them will be in the description. Secondly, and this may come as a shock to some of you, but I actually recommend that you go check out the 2 older episodes of Engines of Minnesota Commercial. Unlike everything else I made before 2022, I actually still really like these videos after a couple of recent rewatches. If you can get through a little over 13 minutes of my old voice,
I really have been sleeping on this for about 7 months, haven't I?
and a little bit of dated humor, I recommend that you watch these videos too. Other than that, thank every single last one of you for sticking around the last 8 years. You all are the best. And if you like this video, subscribe and clang that bell on your way out for more railroading, tractors, and NASCAR videos.